I'm going to talk about poverty and child poverty mostly. I'll say a little bit about inequality, and certainly in the discussion we have at the end, I'll be very happy to discuss issues of inequality. I'm also going to focus on an important event of worldwide significance, which was in September. The United Nations decided on a new set of sustainable development goals that will take us from 2015 through to 2030. Today I'm going to focus on developing countries, but the goals actually apply to every country in the world. They apply as much to Luxembourg as they do to Liberia, as much to Monaco as to Mozambique. I can keep on giving alliterative country examples. Now, the other thing I have to say is today I'm speaking in a personal capacity, not representing the views of UNICEF. Let's look at where poverty is in the Sustainable Development Goals. The first thing to note is I've moved immediately to acronym land. I'm sorry. SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals. And goal 1 is on poverty. So it's the first goal out of 17. And it says by 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere. But extreme poverty is a very low rate. It's $1.90 per day per capita, and that's in purchasing power parity terms. The next goal is about reducing by at least 50%, half of the proportion of men, women and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions according to national definitions. Again, this means that Luxembourg and Liberia, Monaco and Mozambique are all asked to reduce poverty and child poverty by 50% in 15 years. There are other parts of Goal 1 which are about policies that can respond to poverty. And it's worth thinking about these, although I won't talk about them very much. The first one talks about having social protection systems, so both ensuring against economic shocks and also promoting household and family economic well-being, ensuring equal rights to access economic resources, and building resilience of poor people and people in vulnerable situations. So let's keep those in mind as we go. As I said, I'm just going to focus on those first two goals, which are about identifying poverty and reducing poverty. And I'm going to talk about three things which all relate to the goals. The first is children and extreme poverty, the $1.90 measure. The second thing is children and national monetary poverty. And the third thing is children and multidimensional poverty. And I'm going to take them in those terms. So let's start with looking at extreme poverty. As I said, this is a very low line, a very low poverty line. $1.90 per day per person in purchasing power parity. Now, some of you will know this as $1.25 or even $1 a day, because it was updated to the new 2011 purchasing power parities, which brings it up to $1.90 per day. But it's the same incredibly low subsistence level standard of living that is most applicable to the developing world. But it's an international cross-country poverty measure, which means that we can look at the world and we can understand who's poor and how poor they are according to this definition. But because it is such a low line, the focus will be on developing countries. Indeed, the World Bank, when it provides profiles of global poverty, assumes that there's 0% at this level in high-income countries. So today I'm going to give you, in the next couple of slides, some work in progress that we're doing with the World Bank to look at children and extreme poverty. Because it's work in progress and it's not published, I can't give you numbers, but what I'll give you is a picture based on indexes and ratios, and also tell you that we're still doing work on robustness and sensitivity on these numbers. But the story is clear. This is poverty for the whole population. I've indexed it to 100. If we look at the relative risk of poverty for children, then it's almost 150. It's 50% higher than poverty for the whole population. If you then look at ages of children, we see it's highest for youngest children and then declines monotonically by age. But you also see that any child on average in the world on extreme poverty is poorer than adults, prime age 18 to 59, and there's higher levels of poverty compared to the elderly population aged 60 and over. So this is huge, and it's the first time that this has actually been profiled. So watch out for press in June and then October later this year when we actually publish these numbers. But if we think about inequality, then one way of thinking about it is whether the poverty share, so the proportion of people in poverty, is equal to their population share. If poverty was a risk that was distributed equally across everyone, then the proportions of poverty would match the population share. But look, while just under a third of children, a third of the population are children, almost half of poverty is child poverty. Again, we see big differences in ratio for the younger children and smaller ratios for the older children. But if we think about adults, then they're more than half of the population, but less than half of the poor. So children bear a disproportionate weight of poverty using this lowest level of poverty line in the world. Where are these children? So no longer look at the whole population, let's just focus on those children who are extremely poor. Then if we say the average child poverty rate is 100, then in sub-Saharan Africa, the children are over twice as likely to be poor. We see that 20% of the global population live in sub-Saharan Africa, but 45% of extreme child poverty is in sub-Saharan Africa. A shocking concentration in a single region. In South Asia, we see it's about parity. So they're at the average for global poverty. And part of this is India makes up a big population. And that's, again, just about at parity, but is a huge proportion of the globally poor children. If we can reduce poverty to zero in India, we cut world child poverty by about 30%. Elsewhere, outside of sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, we see that the ratios are below parity. And we see that, yes, there's the proportion who are poor, according to their population size, is much less. China, a big proportion of the population, but half that proportion in terms of poverty. China's been doing very well at reducing monetary poverty. Oh, one last thing. Poverty is actually worse in those states that we identify as being fragile states. Fragile can exist because they're in conflict, war or civil conflict, or they can be fragile because of very poor governance or for other reasons. If we look at the ratio of child poverty in these countries, then it's even larger on average than those in Africa, although many of them are in Africa. So we're talking about almost over 2.5 times the global child poverty rate in these fragile states. Okay, that's children in extreme poverty. A snapshot, but hopefully exciting enough for you to want to look at the full set of results we produce later this year. Can you hear me if I move away from the mic at the back? Yeah? Good. Good, because I like to wander around and wave my arms. Let's go to that second goal, because remember, every country in the world has an obligation to reduce child poverty by 50%, and it's an obligation that refers explicitly to children and explicitly to national definitions. And the indicators that have been agreed on this are to use existing national poverty lines. These are lines, unlike the $1.90 line, that each country decides is appropriate as a threshold for monetary poverty in their country. Now, there's a long history to national poverty measurement, and some high-income countries have had these sorts of poverty lines at different times since the Second World War. New Zealand had one very early. America had one in 1963, which has become famous because it's one of the only high-income countries that still is anchored to an absolute poverty line rather than an EU-type relative poverty line. But while countries have had that, not all countries see it as a priority, and not all countries measure poverty. We know this. There are some countries who do not have a poverty measure. Maybe that's because of ideological reasons, countries like North Korea and Cuba. Maybe it's because there's a poor recognition of poverty, or maybe it's because in some countries there just isn't the capacity of national statistical offices, either because of fragility and poor governance, as in Somalia, or just because in a country of 100,000 people, or very small populations, the ability to statistically produce regular poverty reports and everything is not a priority. So we see many Pacific and Caribbean island states not reporting poverty. But we also know this from within the OECD and EU debates, the EU social inclusion debate and child investment debate. We see a lot of difference in terms of countries who adopt strong poverty focus, such as Ireland, UK, versus countries that have less of a commitment to a poverty focus. So we have a difference in prioritization and political backing for poverty, but we also have huge differences in the way that it's measured. Is it absolute or is it relative? In Europe, we tend to think of poverty in relative terms, but in developing countries, it's nearly always an absolute measure that tries to capture basic subsistence needs. Is it measuring income or is it measuring consumption? Again, in the developed world, in EU and OECD and industrialized countries, we tend to think of income. Consumption, however, is used in most developing countries. And what weight is given to children when we measure poverty? What weight is given to their needs? The assumption on those differ very greatly. We just saw the international poverty line that uses a per capita that treats children equally to adults, but in the OECD, we do not. We give less weight to children. So, what we have is every country having to report poverty. So what I did is I went to the United Nations statistics, because every country will give the UN Statistics Commission data on poverty. And this here is 1990 and this is 2014. And I've given every country that's reported a poverty figure for the whole population a little orange square. So what we see is huge differences in patterns, both in regularity of reporting. We have some countries with long blocks where they've reported every year. We have other countries who've only ever reported once. This is Eritrea back in 1993. It's only ever once reported poverty. But we see other countries who don't do it every year, but do it very regularly. Look, every two years, poverty, 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 poverty. Yeah. But across these 168 countries, and they're ordered alphabetically, so it begins with Afghanistan here and ends with Zimbabwe over there, 72% have ever reported poverty between 1990 and 2014. And you think, wow, that's great. Yeah, we've got 3/4 of countries reporting poverty. The less good news is if you look at all those countries above 2009, so recent commitments to poverty, yeah, we go down to about 25%. So this is all about the political prioritization of poverty in the policy agenda and in the reporting. Now, if we then look at how many identify children when they look at national poverty, the situation is even less certain. Sometimes there's a big problem of perception. I can count on my hands the number of times I've been in developing countries where they said, children can't be poor, they don't work. Yeah, because they think poverty is about low wages or about low access to resources. But of course you can identify children in a poverty measure as much as you can identify adults, as much as you can identify people of one ethnicity versus another. You can disaggregate poverty and understand where the risks are highest or different by any individual characteristic in the population. Now, what we've been doing in UNICEF since 2013 is try and map what's been done according to national poverty lines. And we're not asking for huge commitments here. If you've got a national poverty line, producing a child poverty estimate is about 2 hours work. Yeah? And an hour of that will be switching on the computer and finding your programs. Yeah? So any statistician can do this before coffee in the morning. Yeah? It's not a big commitment in resource terms. And we've managed to get data obtained from 89 countries. And this is all since 2009. We don't want old poverty data, we want recent poverty data. Now 89 sounds good, but again, what we have to do is validate these against national poverty lines. We want to get the statistical office to own this child poverty figure. Not to have it produced by a university, not to have it produced by a think tank, but for the National Statistical Office, for the government to own that child poverty number. And when we do that, we get down to 30. And that's kind of depressing, but when you think about countries overall reporting poverty since 2009, we saw 40. So I'm not that depressed. So, but what that means is we need a twofold thing with the Sustainable Development Goals. We need a big effort to make sure that countries regularly commit to measure and to report poverty, and to do so more regular. You know, we need more countries to do it, and we need the countries that do it to do it more regularly. Within that, we need to ensure that there's disaggregation by age, and child poverty should be part of that process. Okay, I'm now going to move on to that third measure. And the indicator that's been agreed is, at national level, is a multidimensional poverty index. And the important thing for those of you who know about multidimensional poverty is that there's no capitals here. So it's not committing itself to a certain approach, a certain methodology, or a certain technique. It's saying a multidimensional poverty index. And we'll have to say how many of those are children living in poverty by that nationally defined multidimensional poverty index. Now, this has been a very interesting story. Multidimensional poverty is fairly recent. A lot of it comes from the seminal work by Amartya Sen on poverty and human development from the early 80s, late 70s. The UNDP created a Human Development Index to run against the sort of GNI, GDP numbers and poverty numbers in the 1990s. It's only more recently that UNDP has actually produced a multidimensional poverty index, and it did that with people at Oxford, at the Oxford Poverty Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, and it's called the MPI. Capital M, capital P, capital I. And that's why I mentioned the earlier non-capitalization of the measure that the UN has agreed. Because we're not setting this to that particular methodology. In fact, UNICEF itself has two methodologies, one that's used in Latin America and one that's used in Africa and elsewhere. So contrary to NPLs, we have an even less consistent approach. We have a minority of countries using very different approaches, using very different techniques with links back to different institutional interests and different academic approaches. So even in Latin America, many countries in Latin America have adopted or are adopting an MPI, capital M, capital P, capital I. So the UNDP type methodology. Honduras, El Salvador, Colombia, lots. Mexico, on the other hand, has said we're going to do our own thing and has its own multidimensional approach called Coneval, which is the organization that's done it, quasi-government. But also Mexico's saying, yeah, this is so good, we're going to tell it to other countries. So we have a range of approaches to multidimensional poverty. But more than that, we actually have opposition to thinking about poverty in multidimensional terms. We have organizations and agencies who are hostile to either the current measures or to producing a multidimensional index at all. And that all these different competing interests came together last year, and that's why we have a multidimensional poverty index with no capital letters. But it does mean there's a giant lack of real consensus about how to take this forward. There's consensus at the high level that we want a multidimensional measure, but no consensus on how to do it and how to frame it. So what do we want to be optimal for a multidimensional measure? Well, I think because it's part of the targets for Goal 1, we need to have it as optimally relating to those poverty responses that we mentioned before. So we want a measure that can frame and look at social protection systems, to ensuring social insurance, social assistance, other forms, universal cash subsidies, all of which are framed in sort of economic or monetary interventions, but which may also have additional interventions alongside them. We want to ensure equal rights to access economic resources, and we need to build the resilience of the poor and those in vulnerable situations. So our multidimensional poverty measure really has to help us form those policy responses if it's to be optimal. We also need to have a clear approach to disaggregation, because remember the target says for men, women and children of all ages. And it also has to be a measurement tool that can capture poverty reduction. Remember the goal is to reduce by 50%. So by 2020, we need to know whether it's gone down by 10%, 20%. Are we nearing the target? We need something that can capture change over time and also the intensity of poverty over time. So there's a huge debate. There's lots of vested interests, both in institutional terms and also in terms of academic ego. Imagine what that's like. And so what I'm going to do today is to be a bit provocative. So hold on to your hats. I'm going to suggest there are three potential underlying ways in which we can build consensus to form an optimal approach. I'm not going to talk about choosing one method or another method. I'm just going to stand back and say what's sensible for me. It may not be sensible for you. The first thing I'm going to suggest is that if we're thinking about poverty, we have to understand how that relates to other aspects of well-being. The concept of well-being is probably more recent than the concept of multidimensional poverty. It's been high on the agenda of EU and OECD. Lots of people have been capturing well-being. Well-being deliberately means more than economic resources. It means psychosocial well-being. It means absence of discrimination. It means a whole range of things which are crucially important. Yeah. But are they poverty? Is poverty or material well-being something within that larger sense of well-being that we should concentrate on? I'm suggesting it would help if we did. That concentrating on material well-being rather than all well-being would help a focus on those economic and material constraints that are in the rest of the goals. So you have something which is about poverty and something which is about more general well-being, in which there are other things that you can put in. It builds on approaches that are already in place in the OECD and EU. The OECD has a well-being index in which there's a set of material and a set of non-material aspects of well-being. I think that conceptually makes sense to me and allows you to understand where poverty is. But it also allows a clear triangulation with monetary poverty measures. Everyone accepts that a monetary poverty measure isn't enough on its own. So what you want to know is what is related to economic constraints or material constraints that operate alongside the lack of money. And also it clearly links to social protection and other policy responses. But how do you actually choose what goes into a multidimensional measure? Well, I've got two suggestions. The first is, and you will not be able to read this, the first is this is a graph of deprivation incidence for the poorest and the richest and the in-between quintiles, so that's every fifth of the population, according to immunization, which is the green line, whether kids are breastfed, which is the brown line, whether they were born in a health facility, which is the blue dotted line, and whether they're stunted. And we also have these black lines, which are about whether they have access to sanitation and access to water. And the big thing to notice is that there's clear gradients. So yes, the poorer are much worse off. There's higher levels of deprivation, especially here, huge levels of deprivation in terms of sanitation. But across all these deprivations, you see a clear gradient except for breastfeeding. Breastfeeding incidence in 27 sub-Saharan African countries does not matter whether you're rich or you're poor. It's not something that has to do with a material constraint. If you put it in your multidimensional poverty measure, you're mixing, you're getting everything soup rather than poverty potage. Yeah? And you lose that focus on your ability to triangulate. It doesn't mean it's not important. Of course it's important. Of course it's important to well-being. Of course it's important to children's future development. But it ain't got nothing to do with an economic constraint. And therefore, if you're trying to align it with poverty, you're going to have difficulty. So that's my first suggestion. Just look. Is there a gradient on the indicator you want to put in? The second thing is, even where there's a gradient, you can actually find real problems and real potential political problems. So the failure to vaccinate children is clearly linked to the presence of evangelical churches in East Africa, because the belief is that children shouldn't be vaccinated. Some of those populations are also not rich. So if you're going to understand what's your policy response is, how you frame your poverty measure, it's important to understand that. Similarly, in Morocco, when they came to look at creating a multidimensional poverty index, there was something about not having a concrete floor or not having a solid floor. And they found very high numbers of people in the Berber population to be poor. And then they realized they all had $1,000 carpets, yeah, covering the sand. Again, a potential political problem. Similarly, in Iraq, before ISIS invaded, we were working on multidimensional poverty and adobe construction of houses rather than concrete or brick or solid wall. Great indicator of poverty in urban areas, but what it did is it actually identified Kurdistan, the richest province in Iraq, as being poor, as having high poverty. So you've got to be careful, yeah? Not only should you look for a gradient, but I'd also suggest you have to look at the underlying relationships to check that what you're putting in a multidimensional poverty measure actually has a reflection on material well-being. But that is contentious. I'm telling you, some people say there's no difference between well-being and poverty. Fine. So my second suggestion, remember we have to identify poverty in all its dimensions for men, women and children of all age groups. And we have to do it in multidimensional terms. Okay. There are things that every member of the population has that can be shared as a poverty characteristic. Their housing, whether they're overcrowded, whether it's in poor repair or has poor construction materials, whether they have access to sanitation, whether they have access to clean water, the level of household assets of different types. That's something that is shared across households, between households, and is common to a poverty risk across the whole population. But then we also have distinctive risks for children or for other population groups. We have their individual health. Are they fully immunised, if that's an appropriate indicator? Did they have access to healthcare? Their education, are they in school? Are they in school at the right grade for age? Do they have the right academic qualifications? All of those are individual. Similarly, are they either stunted or wasted or below average weight? So do they have nutritional deprivation? Now, what we're suggesting in the SDGs is we create national indices that can be also looked at for children and other ages. So the one thing I'm going to suggest is that when we look at our poverty index, we look to capture those general characteristics for the whole population. And that's what some measures do when they're general population, both the MPI and Mexico's Carnival. We then can look at who's poor by age group. So how many people with those general characteristics are poor if they're children? Then we can add those specific child level indicators and reweight those children to incorporate the general and their new indicators. And the result is a consistent national poverty approach using a multidimensional measure that can be disaggregated. And they use the same methodology. They're not using a different methodology for children or a different methodology for the general population. They're using the same thing, so they're consistent. Also, they're arithmetically consistent, so it can all be decomposed and put back together. But most important politically is that you want children in the mainstream of poverty reduction. If you give them their separate index, that's great for the Ministry of Women and Children or great for the Ministry of Welfare, but it's not going to get much traction in the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Planning, the people who allocate resources to reduce poverty. So that's why my suggestion as an optimal approach would be to have these general and disaggregated approaches. My third suggestion, and then we play a little game, is that we prioritise a robustness in the ranking. What do I mean by that? Well, in poverty, you have to know that household A is richer or poorer than household B. Yeah? And then somewhere between A, B, C, D, you draw your poverty threshold and you know who's above or below that line. But if you don't have that consistent ranking, your ability to measure poverty effectively is quite weak. And it's best if that ranking is based on a robust assessment of whatever you want to call it, welfare, well-being. Now, when we do income and consumption poverty, the past 30, 40, 50 years, there's been a huge amount of effort in how to do that consistently to get that consistent ranking. Yeah, Angus Deaton got a Nobel Prize last year for his work on consumption and how to produce consumption aggregates and understanding how consumption patterns are framed. There's been a huge investment in ensuring that those are robust, that we can compare households with 8 people to households with 2 people who have the same income in sensible terms. So investing in a robust ranking, to me, is a principle that you can adopt and then look back to see how you do it, rather than doing it and going, whoops, we have a problem. We haven't got a robust ranking. So if it's one of your 3 priorities, it may help. And the problem at the moment, whoops, is that some of the approaches that we have before us mix both empirical and normative approaches to measuring people's needs and to ranking them. And I think that possibly can lead to suboptimal outcomes if you're looking for measurement and how to respond to poverty. So to finish, we're going to play a game. And the game is called Rank These Children. Okay? So, are you ready to vote? Do you have your arms ready to... Yeah? Because we're going to decide on who is better or worse, who has higher or lower well-being. And the question is, who is poorer? Let's look at Jean and Alice. This is multidimensional poverty just using 2 indicators. So Jean is obese. He's left school to help his father sail their luxury yacht across the Caribbean. Alice is stunted for her age from undernutrition, and her family cannot afford to send her to school. Now this is an easy one. Yeah? Who thinks Alice is poorer than Jean? I think that's almost unanimity. I'm going to check on some people later, because I think that's where the discussion is. Some multidimensional poverty measures, in fact, Tunisia actually has obesity as a factor in its multidimensional, even though rich people are more likely, or there's no gradient in obesity in Tunisia. In America, there's a pro-poor gradient in obesity. In Tunisia, not. And it just measures whether kids are in school or not. So this is a silly example, but I think it helps us look at those principles I mentioned before. That if you're not aligning, if you're just looking at well-being, i.e., do they have well-being in nutritional outcomes? No, neither of them do. But they have very different nutritional outcomes when it comes to aligning with poverty. Second game, Frédéric and Justine. Justine is 13. She lives in a household with 3 brothers, aged 7, 9 and 11. So they're all school age, but all of them go to school. Everyone, Justine and her 3 brothers, all go to school. The household does not have a cell phone. Let's go to Frédéric. He's 13. He lives in a household with 3 brothers, aged 7, 9 and 11. Neither he or any of his brothers go to school, but their dad has one of these cheap PAYG, pay-as-you-go cell phones. Yeah, they cost about $9 in developing countries. It's the business model. The thing is cheap, making calls is expensive. Yeah. Okay, so let's vote. Who thinks Justine is poorer? Who thinks Frédéric is poorer? Whoa, clear majority. I'll come back to you in the discussion. No, this is good. It's promoting difference. Yeah? And we're actually focusing on what matters. The answer is they're both equally poor in multidimensional terms. And that's part of the problem, not distinguishing between household level risks and individual level risks. Yeah? We're equating the household having a cell phone with the individual risk of a child being in school. So if you can't look at general risks versus individual risks, you're going to end up in situations where you're making strange ranking outcomes of children's well-being. Final one, Julianne and Christina. Christina is 13. She neither works nor is in school. Julianne is 13. She works on weekends and evenings to have money to pay her school fees. She is in school. Who thinks Christina is poorer? Who thinks Julianne is poorer? Whoa, this is a difficult one, yeah? The trade-offs are more difficult because we're actually talking about things which are obvious breaches of child rights. Yeah? A child who's working to earn their school fees, yeah, is in school, but is involved in child labour, which we may not want as a positive outcome. Also, their household may have higher income or higher consumption as a result of her work, so material monetary poverty may be lower. Christina neither works nor is in school. That's the worst outcome. Yeah, that's the worst outcome. Okay, I hope that game sort of illustrates some of the things. So what I'm going to do is finish off. How about that for timing? Yeah. Just say, look, to remind you where we are and why I've said what I've said, which is the SDGs directly involve children in the poverty goal. This is good news. It means child poverty is on the agenda. But it is time to get real. Yeah? We've developed lots of ways at looking at child poverty, which are great. We can describe child poverty in eloquent ways for advocacy purposes. But for SDG poverty reduction, we may have to focus on measurability, on applied policy outcomes. Global measures are limited to $1.90 per day. But the good news is even on that very limited measure, the World Bank are beginning to look at children in poverty and are committed to put children into that extreme poverty measure. All the other targets and goals are nationally defined. National poverty lines are well established, but not consistently so. We need to get more countries reporting more regularly. Child poverty using MPLs need active encouragement to put children not only in the measurement, but then to put children and child poverty in the national poverty reduction strategies. Improving female employment rates probably has the biggest single effect on child poverty rates. Improving female employment rates is part of a national anti-poverty reduction strategy. You need other things. You need children to be in school. You need children to have good nutrition. But improving maternal employment rates will help hugely. And child poverty using a multidimensional index needs a lot of thinking and development to ensure both robustness and policy relevance for in multidimensional poverty. Last point, Luxembourg. We're here in Luxembourg. What has this got to do with Luxembourg? Well, the good news is, first of all, you're going to tell me what Luxembourg's doing in a minute. But Luxembourg has been incredibly influential in terms of its role in the UN last year, in terms of its role in the EU, and in taking forward development policy to the developing world. We have the Luxembourg Income Study, based here, that collects data from over 40 countries. They're trying to collect more data from middle-income countries. That's a huge resource. It needs to grow and cover more middle-income countries, but it's a huge resource, both for poverty monitoring and for looking at policy options to reduce child poverty across and within countries. And finally, the University of Luxembourg, our hosts. Yeah, we're happy to have internationally renowned experts in multidimensional poverty and inequality in Luxembourg, and we're very happy to work with them. Thank you.